Good evening. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly night. I want to take a few minutes to briefly talk about what is the Oakland County Suicide Prevention Task Force. The task force is a group of professionals in Oakland County who are working together, looking at data. The health department's one of our partners. We're looking at data for suicide in both Oakland County, across the state and the nation, and we are talking about ways to strategically impact this and what can we all do to educate and impact this issue. So we're from many different disciplines. It just so happens that Michelle and I are both social workers. I work for Oakland County Youth Assistance. We are a community prevention program sponsored by the Circuit Court, the school districts in Oakland County, and the municipalities. And what we do is work with kids and families. It's a free service. We work with kids and families to prevent delinquency, abuse, neglect, other kinds of issues. And what I say is that we work with kids and families when they begin to be at risk or you begin to see small issues so that we can make a positive impact and keep kids on the right track. So we're looking at it from that end, and I'm going to let Michelle talk to you about what she does on her end.
Hello. Again, I'm Michelle, and I am a social worker as well. I work at Havenwick Hospital. Havenwick is the closest psychiatric hospital to Rochester Hills. It's in Auburn Hills, about 15-20 minutes from here. And we offer inpatient and day hospital treatment for children, adolescents, and adults. So if you would like more information about that, we can certainly, I'll be here after to answer any questions you have about how to refer, what the programs are like, any questions that you might have, if any. Okay? So this presentation was put together by the Oakland County Suicide Task Force, and Pam and I, are part of the subcommittee that put it together to standardize it so that we can spread it throughout Oakland County and spread the same kind of messages. So we've all had lots of different trainings. I'm a Safe Talk trainer, which is another program that helps people understand how to talk about suicide, understand the warning signs, and then know how to really talk about it and refer for help. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today, and understand really what you can do to help somebody that is in need. So I have two microphones. I'm not sure really what to do with two microphones. I feel like everybody can hear me. It's kind of a small little group. So the only thing, if you have questions, it's very informal, so please, if you have any questions, if there's something that you really want to learn about or have answered, please feel free to ask, because really we're here to help you, as opposed to, we don't really have an agenda, right? Like, we're just here to talk about what we can do to help this issue. So, all right. So we kind of already went over it, what the objectives are for tonight, but we do want to review facts about suicide, understand that it is a health issue that we need to be more aware of and we need to talk about more freely. We have to learn about the warning signs, we're going to share lots of basic conversation techniques, because even though we think we can talk about it, once it gets to the point that you actually have to ask the question to a loved one or family member, are you having thoughts of suicide? It can be a very difficult conversation, and sometimes the words really don't come out. So it's really important to practice prior to being in that situation. So we're going to do a little bit of about that tonight, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about Oakland County suicide prevention efforts around here. Okay. So this word, what do you see? Stigma, right? I blew it. I said it's stigma first. What word do you see? But what do we see when we think about the word stigma? All of these other words kind of are a part of it. What do you really notice? They're all negative. Okay. What else?
They all make somebody feel worse than they already do.
Absolutely. They all make somebody feel worse than they already do. Yes. that is really what stigma is about, right? It's making people feel like they're not good enough, or that something is wrong with them, right? Or dismisses them. Very good.
I wanted to add, as Michelle mentioned a moment ago, mental health issues are health issues, okay? And when we talk about, oh, so-and-so was diagnosed with cancer, there's no shame, there's no stigma. As a matter of fact, people rally round. They make them blankets. Mm-hmm. They have ribbons. And so we look at other health issues completely differently when it comes to supporting that person, right? But when someone has a mental health issue as opposed to a physical health issue, which guess what? It's all physical, right? Mm-hmm. The brain's part of our body too. There's a totally different viewpoint. And one of the things that we really are trying to do is to shatter that stigma, right? And to make it okay to talk about. Because if it's okay, no one well, I don't think many people have any shame about going for chemotherapy, right? And so they're encouraged to go, it's supported. We need to have the same kind of culture about going when you have a mental health issue. So that's what this is about.
Absolutely. And the only way to do that is to really talk about it and understand it better. So the suicide prevention community, amongst some of the really wonderful leaders in that community, have decided we really need to change the language, that language matters more than we realize. So some of the things that people have said, not even just about suicide, but also about mental health, have a negative connotation to them. So we want to make sure that we are not using those words and using that language anymore, and that we are saying it in a more positive light, right? So some examples, we want to make sure we're saying a person with a mental health condition, a person with schizophrenia, not they are schizophrenic or they are mentally ill. We want to embrace it as it's part of them, but it's not all of them, right? Same with suicide. So suicide is, for years, people have said they've committed suicide, they completed suicide, they had a failed suicide attempt, and that's just really how we've talked about it, right? But what do you hear when you hear somebody say a failed suicide attempt?
That they should have kept trying.
Yeah, that they should have kept trying, or that they failed at that too, right? It's negative, but it's really positive, right? They're alive. That's what we want. So we want to say that they survived a suicide attempt. So changing the negative part of it and making it positive. The died by suicide, it does not roll off your tongue at first, right? But committed suicide, what do you think of when you hear commit? Yeah. And is it positive or negative? Negative, right? Because whenever I think of the word commit, I think they committed a crime, they committed murder, right? It's something negative. So we want to make it just like you would die by cancer, you would die by a heart attack, you would die by suicide. It's just, unfortunately, the way you died. Yes?
I also have learned that it's good to say, or it's good to think of it as died by mental illness, not mental illness, but mental health issues, instead of just died by suicide. They died from depression.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a fair statement as well. Absolutely. Successful suicide, we don't want to say that either, because obviously that makes it into a positive. But really just call a spade a spade. They took their own life and they killed themselves, right? There's no mincing words. So it takes the judgment away. That's the whole purpose. Make sense? Okay. All right, so some statistics that we want to make sure you are aware of, which you are probably aware of some, otherwise you wouldn't be here, right? The first is suicide is the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. It is the second leading cause of death for 10 to 34-year-olds. The first is accidents. 9 out of 100 high school students attempted their life in the past year. So how many of your kids are, I don't know if everybody here has kids, but How many kids are in your high school class?
They just graduated recently. My daughter.
Okay, and how many was in an average class for her? About 30, right? 30, 35, right? So 3 people in every single class is experienced or has experienced a suicide attempt in the past 12 months. That's a lot, right? That is a staggering statistic. Males die by suicide 3.5 times more often than females. The other piece to that is that females do attempt more often, but males die more often. Why do you think that is?
The way that getting to
Absolutely.
I shouldn't say the way, but how it's
The
carried.
method, yeah.
It's methodology.
It is. Men choose more lethal means, although that is changing, right? Women, it's a different world. So women have access to guns and lethal means just as really easily as men do these days. So that is changing, but this is still the statistic as it stands. For every reported suicide, there are 5 to 25% more unreported.
Just a little comment on that. When we started doing this about 3 years ago, looking at Oakland County statistics from the coroner's office, they were working with us, but oftentimes there's no, if a doctor or a police officer doesn't call it a suicide, it's not registered. So, you know, it might be cause of death was,
Undetermined
right?
or something.
Or, yeah, or accident or drug overdose. If they don't find a note on the person, they don't. So that's where a lot of things are going unreported. We're working on that, though.
Absolutely. And I think, too, why would somebody be afraid to say it was suicide, right? Because of stigma that's attached to that. So it's important, again, to raise awareness so that people can be honest about it. And grieve it properly, right? It's a different grieving process, too. And then firearms account for 51% of all suicide deaths. So it is the most lethal means, and it is the highest method that we spoke about. Yes?
All the drug overdose, I thought that would outweigh guns.
So the issue with drug overdose is that it's not classified as suicide necessarily.
That's where we're not
So
sure.
it's a different, it's counted differently.
Mm-hmm.
So while it may be, right, the opioid epidemic is huge amongst other drugs, right? It's not just opioids, but the cause of death isn't always rolled as suicide. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about facts versus myths. Do you want to do facts versus myths? Okay. All right. So we hear about myths, and these are things like old wives' tales that have stuck with us for years that we think are correct, but they're really not. So the first myth is people who talk about suicide are just trying to get attention. What do we think? No, right? It's that is probably the worst myth that I can think of. If somebody is in need of, like, if it's classified as they're trying to get attention or attention-seeking behavior, that individual does need attention, right? That is why they are reaching out to you. They need help. And so to dismiss them and say, oh, they're just looking for attention or they're attention-seeking is probably the worst thing that you can do. So we want to make sure that it's not going to put the idea in their head, but the fact is that talking about suicide is a warning sign, and we must take all talk about suicide seriously. Okay? Any questions about that? All right. The next one is, the myth is suicide often happens without warning. Is that true or false? I mean, it's a myth. I'm telling you it's a myth, right? Like, it's a myth. So, so the fact is, almost everyone who dies by suicide displays some sort of warning sign. And I think that oftentimes individuals either don't see it, or once you learn about what they could be, it will come to you. Now, this is almost, it is not an absolute, right? Some people, there may not be any warning signs, okay? Yes.
I was gonna say, sometimes the, warning signs, I lost my train of thought, I'm sorry.
No problem, no problem. It'll come back to you, just shout it out when it does. And learning about warning signs is important, right? And we're gonna talk about warning signs in just a few minutes.
Oh, I know what it was.
Yes,
I was gonna say sometimes they might talk about suicide or may not, but they're depressed and they suddenly feel better. And that's often because they've made the decision to end their life, so they feel some relief.
absolutely.
And so you think, oh, they're getting
Mhm.
better. And so
Absolutely.
this makes it tricky because sometimes they are getting better and
Right.
sometimes.
I think you're 100% accurate. And I always say that one of the warning signs that we do have to be aware of is if somebody's mood suddenly changes without intervention. So if they've had intervention, if they've had a hospitalization, if they're in therapy, if they have started medication, if there has been an intervention with that individual, and then you notice a positive swing in their mood, then that can be a good thing. But if you notice a positive change in their mood without any intervention and nothing has changed, yes, that would be 100% a warning sign that you would need to address that and talk with that person to see if they are at peace with their decision. All right, the next one is only certain types of people die by suicide. True or false? False, right? So it is an old myth that sometimes you should be able to pick out a person who's going to end up killing themselves, right? That they look a certain way, that they are from a certain demographic area, that they are from a certain race, that they are, like, there's specifics, right? But that none of that is true. Suicide does not discriminate, and it actually has affected every single person from every background in the world. The next one is people who are suicidal are just overreacting to life events. Right, totally false. Everyone reacts differently to stressors, right? We all have our limits. And for some people, you might think, wow, they've got it all, right? They've got a beautiful wife, and they have a beautiful home, and they have a beautiful dog. And yet they are having suicidal thoughts or have died by suicide. You might not understand that, but you don't know all of the internal things that are that individual is experiencing, right? So you certainly cannot dismiss somebody just because you think they should be handled one more thing, right? It's different for everybody. The important thing to know is that if it is a loved one, you know your loved ones, you also know your coworkers better than you realize. So you're going to notice any changes in their behaviors, especially their daily routines, that you have to be aware of. And after we talk about warning signs, then you're going to know if, Susie comes to work every day and she is normally chipper and happy and has her coffee in her hand and her makeup done and hair done and looks her best. And then on Tuesday she comes in and she's completely disheveled and has been crying and sad. You're going to talk to her, right? You're going to ask her. You're not going to just dismiss it. You have to realize that if a sudden change in their mood could be a warning sign, and it's worth a conversation, right? We can't be afraid to have those conversations. She might not be having suicidal thoughts, but you don't know unless you ask, right? Okay. Talking to someone, this is probably the most prevalent myth that has been around for the longest time, that even in clinicians and experts in the field still at times can have a problem understanding. But the myth is talking to someone about suicide will put the idea in their heads. We've all heard that myth before, I assume, right? And it's not true. Speaking openly about suicide lets people know you are comfortable talking about it. That's all. You certainly cannot, by asking somebody if they're having suicidal thoughts, they're not going to say, oh, that's a great idea. That's just not the case. And there's tons and tons and tons of research that supports that. So we cannot be afraid to ask the question. Okay? All right. So, I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay. So now we are going to talk about risk factors, right? We have to know what individuals might be at risk for, so that, we have to know what, go ahead.
I just want to, okay, sorry. When we talk about risk factors, I want to make it very clear, these are based on the data, okay? You know, we're all, human beings are all individual. So I don't want anyone to think that, oh, because it was up there, that means A, B, or C, or because it wasn't up there, that means A, B, or C. We are talking about data, and so these are the risk factors that have the highest, you know, the highest numbers associated. If you've had a previous suicide attempt, the likelihood is higher. A history of substance abuse, obviously that's a higher likelihood. A physical disability or illness, losing a friend or a family member to suicide. Ongoing exposure to bullying behaviors, a mental health condition, recent death of a family member or close friends, access to harmful means, and relationship problems. So these are some of the major risk factors.
And it's important to be aware too that if you are aware of them, like having access to harmful means, if you remove the harmful means, if you know that your loved one is suffering and they have a gun and that gun is then removed, their chances of actually going on to die by suicide reduce greatly. So being aware if they are at risk, that you then remove those means. If they did have a family member or loved one die by suicide, it does not put the idea in their head, like we mentioned, but it is important to be aware of that, that for their loved one, that was their out, right? And so if they're having a hard time and they're struggling with that, you have to be aware of that when you are talking with them, so that you can help them get help more quickly as well. The previous suicide attempts, I think it's important to mention as well. While yes, it does increase your risk, I believe the statistic is around 90% of individuals that have one suicide attempt do not go on to attempt again. So that's important to know too, that not everybody will attempt again, although it does increase your risk of potentially attempting again. So it's kind of contradicting, but that's the stat. So, any questions about risk factors? Okay, so on the other side of risk factors are then protective factors. The protective factors are very, very important, and I think that you can look at them and kind of understand them pretty easily. Connection to non-parental parents, adults, yes.
I just want to talk about protective factors,
Yeah.
if I can.
Yeah,
Nope. This is where I just want to jump in because this is sort of what I do. And one of the reasons that we're here tonight is because we want to put protective factors in place in all of our communities. You know, psychiatrists can't be everywhere, right? It has to be neighbors, friends. So kids, young people that have experienced academic achievement, right? That's a protective factor for kids. And kids who are not producing academically, right? It's hard for them. And they need to feel good about themselves in other ways, right? Not everyone's, you know, not everyone's going to be an astronaut, right? They're not all going to be, but kids need to feel a sense of mastery, connectedness to parents, and connectedness to other non-parental adults. That's huge. We've got, you know, I could go into a whole discussion about two-parent working households and how it's hard, and so if you can be an adult for a kid in your neighborhood, that's huge. School safety, closeness of caring friends, and overall resilience that is just sort of built into kids sometimes, and nurtured, the safety of the neighborhood, and awareness of and access to local health services. All of these prove to be protective factors, and you can see why it has to start young, right? It's never too late to put more protective factors in place, but it's crucial that we start as young as possible to put these things in place.
Okay, so we've gone over risk factors, protective factors. We kind of understand how we're going to talk about suicide in terms of what we're going to call it, and how we're going to say it. And now we have to really understand the different kinds of warning signs. So there's things that we're going to see, there's things that we are going to hear, and there are things that we're going to just observe. And we need to make sure that we understand all of those. So initial suicide warning signs are things that people might say. And wouldn't it be wonderful if everybody was that forward and just said it and we didn't have to observe it or think it, right? But not everybody is. So we can start with what they say. If this individual says they want to kill themselves, they want to die, they feel like a burden, they feel hopeless, they feel like they have no purpose, they feel trapped or pressured, or they're in extreme pain. Individuals that die by suicide want to escape the pain that they are experiencing, right? It's not that they necessarily want to die. So it's important to really listen for that word of pain, okay? Anything else you can think of that you might hear somebody say that would indicate that they're having thoughts of suicide? Yes? That is coming up, but I'm happy to answer it now. To start the conversation, the most important thing is to let that individual know why you're concerned and what you've observed before you just say, are you having thoughts of suicide? So we're gonna actually practice it coming up, but that's the most important thing, is there's going to be a reason why, whatever reason that came into your head that you think this individual might be suffering or might be having thoughts of suicide, that's what you're going to say. I've noticed that you've been withdrawing from friends. I've noticed that you've been feeling that you've been isolating and maybe not engaging in normal activities that you've been previously loved. I notice you're not taking care of yourself. I notice that you're not eating. Maybe you've lost weight. I also noticed that you're failing all of your classes, right? So I've noticed all of these things are happening. Sometimes when an individual is experiencing these things, they are having thoughts of suicide. Are you having thoughts of suicide? And that's really how you ask the question. So you have to let that individual know why you're asking and what you've observed, and then ask the question. But we're going to practice. Yes?
From personal experience, I know that you could ask the question, sometimes they will leave the comment.
Of course.
Say, "I'm okay."
Of course. So that is something that you have to take a bit further, right? If you know that individual and you know that they are, if you have that kind of gut feeling that something is wrong and something is not right.
Or at least not okay to me. No.
Absolutely. So they might not be having suicidal thoughts, but that doesn't mean that they need some sort of intervention, right? They need to be connected with a therapist. They need to be connected with a community resource. And we're going to add that at the end, that we do have a list of community resources for you to take with you, a parent toolkit. There's lots of things. Pam's going to go over all of the resources at the end. But just because a person is not admitting that they're having suicidal thoughts, again, does not mean that they don't need some sort of intervention. Absolutely, yes, absolutely. And that's important too, right? The point of us being here tonight is really just so we can have that conversation and connect somebody. You're not going to fix that individual by asking them if they're having thoughts of suicide. You have to be comfortable asking the question and having that conversation, and then taking your loved one to somebody who can actually assess them and intervene. Right? So that's really why we're here. Maybe we should have said that in the beginning. All right, the next warning sign that is the category is do. So it's something that an individual might do that we need to be really aware of. So perhaps they're isolating from family or friends, withdrawing from activities. Any extreme changes in their sleep or eating patterns, posting about death online. The internet is a necessary evil, and sometimes, just so in case anybody didn't know this, I learned this recently, which I thought was very interesting. So on social media, if you have a button, there's a report button that you can push if like somebody posts something that you think is inappropriate. I thought it was like if something was inappropriate in terms of porn or something, like really negative in that respect, that you'd report it and then they'd have to take it off. I've recently learned that it is not just for something like that, that if somebody posts that they are having suicidal thoughts, whether they're extremely depressed, hopeless, helpless, worthless, etc., and you report that post, that there is a social media intervention that will then contact that individual. I didn't know that. So if you see something that you don't feel comfortable intervening with, you can report that post, which I think is excellent and so necessary. Any increased substance use. So one of the risk factors was substance use. If it is out of the ordinary for them, if that behavior is not typical and they are using alcohol or drugs more regularly and there's an increase or change, that would be a warning sign as well. And then any reckless or risky behavior. That can look like a variety of things. Anybody want to explore that a little bit more? Reckless or risky behavior, what that might look like? Yes.
Maybe communicating or hanging out with people because we know
Absolutely.
people that drink and drugs. Just hanging out with them and makes sense to do what they're doing.
Absolutely. Because they don't necessarily care anymore, right? They don't care what happens to them. That's why they're engaging in this risky behavior, because they just don't care at this moment in time. So yes, definitely hanging out with the wrong crowd, engaging in high-risk sexual behavior, shoplifting. I mean, there's a variety of really risky behaviors that you would need to be aware of, or that should then be some sort of a warning sign if it's not typical behavior for that individual. And then what they are feeling. So if an individual expresses to you that they are feeling depressed, sad, anxious, or if you're observing that they're depressed, sad, anxious, hopeless, ashamed. The ashamed and humiliation piece of this is something that I think as a society we have not experienced until now. Youth and adults are being humiliated and shamed in ways that we never even imagined when we were younger, right? If somebody was making fun of us or pushed us in the locker, the only people that knew about it were the people that saw it, right? Now they post it online. Your community knows, your neighborhood knows, your entire school knows, your state knows, or at least that's what it feels like. Everybody knows. These kids have thousands of friends, and they post a terrible video of Johnny getting pushed in the locker or Johnny getting beat up or whatever the case may be, and you can't get away from that shame. So that individual is really internalizing that the whole world knows, and the whole world kind of does, right? They've seen it. So really being aware of that, I think, is probably one of the most important things to really be aware of, is that shame. Feeling angry, especially again if it's a change in their mood, irritable, agitated, or if they're experiencing really numbness and they're not really feeling anything. Anxiety, there is increased risk for somebody that has anxiety. Sorry, I want to touch that. So I know often anxiety is kind of dismissed or pushed like it's normal. Everybody's anxious these days, but it is important to understand that anxiety has lots of levels, and if it really escalates and gets to that panic that you can't get out of, you have to be aware of that too. It should not be dismissed either. Any other thoughts about any feelings that you might observe or think about? Okay. So now, what can you do, right? We've given you the information. We kind of have an understanding of what the warning signs might be, what we need to be aware of, but what do we do, right? That's really the question. How do we help our loved ones? So, how do we start a conversation about suicide? The most important thing is really to, like I kind of already mentioned, is to let them know why you're getting to this point. What are your concerns? What are you observing? You don't seem like yourself right now. What's really going on? You seem really sad or down, angry, unhappy lately. I'm worried about you. Right? You're not going to just come out and say, hey, Bobby, are you having suicidal thoughts? Right? You've got to build that rapport and have them understand that you really do care. Individuals that are suffering from suicidal thoughts often feel completely alone, that nobody cares, that the world would be better off without them. Right? They feel that they are a burden to everyone in their family, loved ones, friendship circle, etc. So you have to let them know you care. And the only way you're going to do that is by letting them know that you really do care, right? And you care because you noticed and observed these specific things. I've noticed you haven't been doing an activity you previously enjoyed. What's going on? So again, that's just starting the conversation of why you're concerned in the first place. I do want to say it is extremely anxiety provoking for the person that is asking the question, right? To have a conversation that you've never had before about somebody who is so important to you that you care about if they are going to live or die, you're going to be nervous, right? You're going to feel like a duck in water and their little feet are paddling so quickly, right? But on the surface, that duck is beautiful and serene, and you are going to just have to keep that inside while you have that question, right? You have to let that individual know that you are comfortable with what they're about to say. Because if you're not comfortable, they're not going to be honest. Okay? So you have to cry later. Okay? All right. So how do I ask about suicide? Sometimes when people are feeling hopeless, missing school, withdrawing from friends and family, they are thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? It sounds simple, right? But ask a question in your head. I want you to say, read this paragraph in your mind. Oops, sorry. Okay. How did that feel, reading it, saying it?
Hard, 'cause I'm just looking at my brain. Do you have this, I don't have this information to hand out? You
Yeah.
have this conversation tonight?
Yes. I don't know if we have this specifically, though, but yeah, absolutely.
It feels, for me, even though I am doing this, it feels uncomfortable. It is an uncomfortable, it doesn't just roll off your tongue.
I think too, probably, true, was their relationship to their friend and family? How well you know that person? Like your child or other things? It would be very important. Absolutely.
It seems like there should be a different word besides when you think about suicide.
So you think about hurting yourself.
That's,
So there's actually really specific reasons why it doesn't say hurting yourself, right? So, like I previously mentioned, if somebody is having thoughts of wanting to die, they don't want to hurt themselves necessarily, right? They just want the pain to end, okay? So some individuals think of self-harming as a coping skill. That doesn't mean that that individual necessarily wants to die, right? It's just how they cope. So there's actually a really big difference between harm and hurting and death. So you have to be direct. You have to use the word suicide.
I think we also, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you ran into someone you hadn't seen in a while and they lost all their hair, right, would you say, oh, are you not feeling well? You know, you would say, oh my gosh, it looks like I see you don't have any hair. Are you going through chemo? Do you have cancer? People would be comfortable saying that, right? We have to be comfortable asking about suicide because the person that's dealing, right, with all the emotional stuff, they don't want to say it because they don't want to burden other people. If you are comfortable enough to have a conversation, people know it's not burdensome to tell you, right? It's just like we tell our kids, you can tell me anything. Can they really? Right? Are we saying that you can tell me anything, but you really can't because I don't want to, you can tell me everything except for suicidal thoughts, right? No, we have to get very comfortable with saying exactly what it is, and that's a part of getting rid of the stigma, right? And about part of having the courage that if I care about you, I can handle whatever you're about to say. Not that I can fix it, but I can handle hearing it.
And the more that we are comfortable using the word, the less the stigma will be around. So it is hard, and I know you want to mince words. It's uncomfortable to say, but it actually is the most important part of this presentation, is learning to say, are you thinking about suicide?
It has to be direct also because if I said to my friend, you know what, I know you've been
down lately and you're not engaged in the activities you used to do before, you're not thinking about suicide or anything, are you? It's very, right? That's more comfortable for me to say it that way, but that's a quick way that the other person's gonna say, she doesn't wanna hear it. No.
That's a don't.
Yeah,
Right?
don't do that.
That's a don't. That's a, you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? No, that individual, would you be willing to say to the individual saying, you're not having thoughts of suicide, are you? Would you tell them yes? No, you sure wouldn't, because you wouldn't feel like they were ready to hear it. So there's important things that we have to really be aware of when we are going to ask that question, though. We have to make sure that we are listening to the individual, right? We are all distracted today. I'm distracted today. I'm guilty too, right? Our phones are everywhere, and they are our third appendage. But if we are having this conversation, we have to make sure that that phone is down, that we are listening with 2 ears, that we don't need to leave in 5 minutes to go pick up our, other child or what have you. We have to give them the time that they deserve in that respect. So if you don't have the time to sit down and actually listen, then you got to connect them with somebody else, because it's probably not going to be the best conversation, right? We have to be ready to listen. The other piece, if you're asking that question, it's not the time to offer advice. It's not going to be like, well, you'll find a new wife and it'll be okay if they're going through divorce, right? It's not the time to say we're going to fix this right now. You just need to listen and let them know that you're there for them and that you want to connect them with somebody who can help them and intervene on a professional level. That's it. Just that you care and that you want to help them get help.
Most people
Yes.
who are in professional health will have there's a HIPAA law, and I have a family member who I'm worried about, and I know they're in professional health, but I would like to contact that person and go, I'm seeing more signs. Then you might think that she might be disclosing, but she's over 18, so I can't.
So HIPAA doesn't apply to, you're not the healthcare professional, right? So the healthcare professional cannot release information to you, but you can call and leave a voicemail for anybody you want. It doesn't apply to you.
So I can leave a voicemail.
Absolutely. It doesn't mean that, yeah, absolutely. The HIPAA is about the healthcare professional cannot release protected health information. They cannot give you protected health information. They can't even confirm or deny that a patient is a patient if there's not a release of information. But as a loved one, you can call whoever you want.
I don't think about that, I just
Yeah.
want them to know.
Yeah, you can call whoever you want. Especially when it's life or death. Right? We also want to make sure that when we're having the conversation that we're asking open-ended questions, that they can't just say yes or no to other things about, like, let's talk about how are you feeling? What have you been experiencing? What is troubling you at this point? Like in that beginning piece of building that rapport, you want to make sure that you are allowing them to talk and giving them that platform. You want to validate them and let them know how proud you are of them for talking to you about this, and that opening up, it's really important, and that validate that their emotions are real. Not minimize and not judge. We don't want to ever pass judgment on them. We also don't want to demand answers on them. It's their time to talk. It's our time to listen. And then kind of ending that piece is then connecting them with a healthcare professional, right? Even if you're a healthcare professional, even if you're a social worker, a psychiatrist, a physician, whatever, if it is your loved one, you can't intervene in that way, right? You have to connect them with another healthcare professional that can. Encourage help seeking. So if you ask them about suicide and they said yes, if your loved one said yes, we want to let them know that we are going to encourage them to seek help, right? So these are just some kind of sentences that you can use. It sounds like you think there's no way out, but it can get better. Let's talk about some options, and we're going to talk about some community resources that are in your area before we leave tonight. I'll come with you to talk to the teacher, coach, school counselor, etc., your parents. If you are that adult connected person in that youth's life, letting them know that you're there for them and that you will go with them to talk with their parents can be really important, right? You're showing them that they're going to be a part of this process. You're not just taking the information, I'm gonna tell your parents and then they'll come talk to you. But bringing them with to show them that we're gonna walk through this together, that I'm there for you. Let's call or text the Common Ground Resource and Crisis Helpline together. The Common Ground Resource and Crisis Center in Pontiac is actually an amazing thing that Oakland County has. It is a resource center that not every county has. Most don't. And it is a 24/7, the crisis line is 24/7. You can call from anywhere, and they can help direct you to get help. So that's just one resource, and there's lots of others that we can talk about.
You also, I just want to mention, someone can call the crisis helpline for just about anything, right? Just so people know, you don't have to be having suicidal ideation. You can be a teenage girl whose boyfriend just broke up with her and she's upset, right? Just so that people are aware, you know, you can use that helpline for a lot of different things. If you're emotionally not in a good place, or you need sort of a person that's not in your life to have a conversation with, a non-involved person. It's not therapy, right? But sometimes in a small crisis or a big crisis, it's helpful.
Yes.
Okay, you have a conversation with this person.
Yes.
He or she says, I do want to kill myself.
Yes.
Do suicide. Then what's the next step to do?
You can say, this sounds like a health crisis, right? And when you are having a heart attack, right, or something's going on with your physical health, you don't say, why don't you call an ER, why don't you call your own ambulance, right? You'd say, I will get you to the hospital, or I will call 911 with you and get you what's needed. Same thing if they seriously are having suicidal thoughts, let's call this crisis line together, right, and get some assistance in here. And then they can call police. I mean, there's various things that happen as a result of that. It's 24/7.
And we have that list for you of community resources.
Yeah.
So, again, if it's in the middle of the night, you have to be aware of what is available. So if they do have a therapist that they see once a week at 5 o'clock on Mondays, if it's in the middle of the night or the weekend, you're not gonna be able to call that therapist, right? So you have to understand where you're at and know the resources at the time that you're really asking to. And then let that person help decide. If they are saying, yes, I am having thoughts of suicide, they told you because then they are willing, hopefully, to get help. So then you can go through these options. What sounds best to you, right? Give them the autonomy to help decide what is their next step. Do they want to go to the emergency room? Do they want to start by calling the crisis line? Do they feel like they're not safe enough to drive in a car with you and we need to call 911? Safety is the top priority, right? So we have to make sure that you are going to be safe and that they are going to be safe. So even if you feel like if I call 911 right now, they're going to be mad at me forever, they're going to be alive, right? So who cares if they're mad at you for the time being, right? So that would be a time that you still need to connect them with a community resource, right? Just because somebody is not having active suicidal thoughts does not mean that they don't necessarily need therapy, does not mean that they need a higher level of care than you can offer, okay? So perhaps that doesn't warrant an emergency room visit at 2 a.m. if they're not having active suicidal thoughts, but you can still call the crisis line. You can still stay with them that night if you feel comfortable and if they are safe, and come up with a plan to call the therapist at 8 a.m. the next morning, or whatever they are comfortable with and you are comfortable with, but that you will also still stay with that individual, right? Safety is the top priority.
You know, I keep trying to put this in my mind of a health crisis. So, my father-in-law didn't like doctors, right? So if he was having some chest pains, right, and I'd say, I think we need to call an ambulance, he'd say, I think I'm all right. And
a lot of it has to do with the personality of the person, how well you know them, what would I do? There's a lot of factors. But the important thing is, even if you are not sure, you can call the crisis line yourself. Say, look, I had this conversation with someone, and I just don't feel good about it. What would you recommend? Would be my next step. You know, there's no foolproof system, but however many resources you can connect with or get that person connected with, you know, you're reducing the odds.
Absolutely. And you have to understand too that people on the other end of the line of the crisis line, they are trained to ask these questions and assess the situation, so they can help you make that decision if this does warrant an ER visit, if you should call 911. They will be able to help assess the situation as well, or at least in theory, right? Any other questions about safety? I know we spoke earlier about removing means. If their suicide plan is to overdose and you have found the large collection of pills, making sure to remove that from the home. Guns, if you're not comfortable, if their plan is to use a firearm, to make sure that firearm is removed, not necessarily by you, but police can move it, a loved one can move it, but removing means is very important.
Tylenol.
Safely, yes.
Tylenol, even over-the-counter things.
Over-the-counter, so Tylenol and ibuprofen are very lethal when taken in large amounts. So oftentimes people think we have to just remove the prescription drugs. It's also Tylenol and ibuprofen. They are very dangerous when taken in large amounts. So do not underestimate the power of Tylenol and ibuprofen. Okay. When in doubt, too, 911 is who you should call as well. I just want to add that little piece in there. We went through kind of some of these. I want to make sure everybody does grab these. I pulled them over here for you, Pam.
Okay.
I got you the whole thing. So Pam's going to go over some of the resources, and then we're going to answer really any questions that you have.
So there's a lot of papers out on the table, and here's what I know about literature materials because I do it myself. I'll go, that looks good, that looks good, that looks good. I shove it in my bag, and then it goes on the pile of papers on the dining room table until it gets too big and I have to throw them all in the trash. So I want you to be purposeful, right? So I'm going to just take a minute to talk about what's over there. These are community resources, different youth shelters, child care referrals, free family support services, domestic violence hotline. These are just general where to get help in the community. Because as I said, the protective factor is, right, if there's somebody at risk, let's get support for them. I mean, not necessarily about suicide, but just about life in general. So that's what this is with the yellow. This is kind of a bulleted overview of what we've gone over tonight. The crisis line is on here, call Common Ground. Get professional help if you notice these behaviors, and it lists some behaviors. It's just a sort of very quick one little page about some of the things that we went over tonight. Information about Havenwood Hospital and their services. This yellow card is a really nice little thing to have in your wallet because it's got the crisis line on it. So if you just kept it in your wallet, you never know when someone might need it, or take two, one to have and one to give away. And on the back are some victim assistance programs number, youth runaway information, just some other resources, hotlines. Common Ground that operates the hotline. They also have a lot of other programs that they sponsor, so they're all listed on here. Oakland County Youth Assistance, as I mentioned, is a community prevention program. It's free to all kids and families all across Oakland County. We're a good resource. There's 26 offices, one in every school district in the county. So if you need a resource for a young person, you can, whether you come in and talk to somebody or just call and say, hey, I'm looking for a resource. They
toolkit for parents, just some more talking points to, for talking to your young people, like myths and facts. We went over some of these things. And the next step
That's
for
it, that's our day hospital.
Haven, right, this is the outpatient information, okay? And then the community coalition also brought some materials about substance abuse prevention. So, please take advantage of what you think you might need, but definitely take a yellow card, because it's the easiest thing to put in your wallet. It won't go on the dining room table and then end up in the trash can, right?
This last piece we mentioned about means restriction, just different things to be aware of that can be harmful. So making sure you remove the firearms, medications, not just prescription, but also over the counter, alcohol and poisons, all of those things can be used. So we want to make sure that they are, precautions are taken for things that you might not think of. There are some additional trainings that our task force puts on. Safe Talk is one of them. It is a 3.5-hour training to go in much further depth about how to talk about suicide, having that conversation, warning signs. It's a wonderful program. I am a trainer, so if you would like to contact me afterwards, we can talk about that as well. Youth Mental Health First Aid. Assist is also it's a 2-day training. It's very comprehensive in terms of how to also intervene. So you're not just asking the question and then connecting them with the resource, but there's more training about how to actually intervene for the individual that might be having thoughts of suicide.
I just want to mention,
Yes.
all of the information that we've given tonight is, you can go to oakgov.com, suicide prevention, or the Oakland County Health Department. They kind of hold all of our information, and any trainings that are going on around the county would be available on that website. So if you're interested, this was just 101, right? This is just introduction. If you're interested, like you mentioned, how to have the conversation, if you want to practice that more, if you want to hear more scenarios, they go through different scenarios. Like Safe Talk, it's a free training. It's a couple hours, but it's a good
3.5
training.
hours. It is.
I highly recommend it for college people, and 15 and up. It's intended for 15 and up. So if you have high school students, college students, yourselves, it is a really good training that's more comprehensive than what we're able to do tonight.
Okay. And then this is just all of the organizations that are part of the Suicide Prevention Task Force.
If you're familiar with any, you can get information from them as well.
Yes. And then that's my contact information. I think Pam has her contact information as well. Yes.
You know, the Safe Talk training, I did that through my work. Is there a reason why they won't bring that into high schools to make it part of the curriculum so every kid would be educated?
Well, each high school district, the decisions about curriculum are made by the school board. So those are questions you would have to go to your school board about. What are you doing to educate? I mean, maybe they're not doing Safe Talk, maybe they're doing something else, right? I don't know what each school district is doing, but it is available to take into schools. We take it into schools.
We went to Rochester High School, did an all-staff training for their entire school.
Right, that's what I did, yeah. Sorry, I mean the kids.
Rochester High School.
Like,
Yep.
9 through grade 12.
And I
right?
think, actually, I think Adams did as well.
So they could.
I think that they did as well
Yeah,
last
they
year.
could. They could. Are there any other questions?
Where is bullying today?
Well,
What happened, we hear that happen in school with that. Is that like the beginning of thinking?
well, we talked about all the emotions, right? When I say, I want to be very careful, and I don't know that we do such a good job in this presentation. So, because someone's bullied doesn't necessarily lead to suicide, right? Because someone's using drugs doesn't necessarily lead to suicide. But there's many steps along the way, and what you really want to look at is what are the emotions associated with that, right? Some kids come home, cry, slam the door, you talk about it, they go back the next day, and they try to get over it. Some kids are more resilient than others. The bullying that is just pervasive and persistent, and sometimes it's hard for kids to get away from it because kids are attached to their social media. Like back when we were kids, if there was somebody bothering you at school, you could come home and play with the kids in your neighborhood maybe, or your siblings, or whatever, and you don't have to deal with that. You get a reprieve from that, at least until tomorrow, right? Or the weekend comes and you get a break from being constantly put down and humiliated. But nowadays, the reason bullying's so, it's not that bullying is worse or kids are meaner than they ever were. I don't know that that's true. What I do know is that it never ends because kids don't shut off the phone, right? So what someone said at school gets all passed around the school via not little pencils and papers and slipping the notes, right? They just put it right on social media. So kids don't get away from that. So when we talk about bullying, what we really need to talk about is limiting kids' access to social media. And what is social media? Is everything on social media true? Because guess what? Very little is true. And so are you using your, are you using your computer for homework, or are you using that to get validation of your own self-esteem? Because that's what kids are doing. And so when that's feeding their self-esteem and now it's not, right, it feels like the world is over for them, their life is over, because it kind of is, because that technology is such a huge part of their life and their self-validation. So we really need to change that as a culture and a society. It's dangerous. But unfortunately, other people are, advertisers, whatever, are doing more to impact that, I think. Any other questions? I do want to ask, we are having the
Yep.
surveys.
Yeah.
We are doing, this is a fairly new presentation, and so I really would appreciate your feedback if you wouldn't mind filling out a survey for us that sort of gives us some feedback of, what if you learned something, if you didn't, what could be improved. And I'll leave
And then Pam and I will be here as well if anybody wants kind of individually ask questions, not in a group, for a little while. Okay? But thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. Just you being here helps reduce the stigma that is surrounded by mental health and suicide. So thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of the evening.